Hello, hello. Welcome. Today's episode of the podcast is going to be all about podcasting. So, as of today, I am 81 episodes into my podcasting journey, and I want to share some quick metrics with you before we jump in. So, total downloads have been around 65,000, which is super exciting that, there's been 65,000 of you who've listened to these episodes. I've poured my heart and soul into this, and so it's so cool to see that number growing to such a big mark. And this podcast has brought in revenue directly from brand sponsorships at $82,000 so far, which is really amazing. I started this podcast in August of 2024. So it's just been about a year and a half, and we're almost at six figures in revenue, which is so cool. There's also been a ton of indirect impacts that are a little bit harder to quantify. So my Instagram growth is really going well. My engagement on Instagram is really going well. I feel like I've gotten to know so many more people since starting my podcast. I think just because you guys hear me in your earbuds every week, and it makes me feel like a more, human. And so I'm getting to chat with you guys, and it's just so much fun. And that's also led to a lot more trust in my audience, right? Which has led to people enrolling in my course, the Private Practice Academy bundle, or my Reels membership. And that is just so, so, so cool. I get a lot of questions from therapists about podcasts, and whether or not they should do one, what it's like, when you should start, if it takes a lot of time, all of that. And so I wanted to record this podcast episode for you. So in today's episode, we are going to go into all of the details on how and why I decided to start a podcast, what it's actually been like to record 81 episodes, and when I think podcasting makes sense for you and your business, and when I think that it does not make any sense to do at all. So let's dive in. I want to start off by talking about why I decided to start a podcast and when that right time was for me. So, there's a lot of different ways that therapists can scale. And I think especially if you are a therapist who markets yourself on Instagram, you are going to find that there's a lot of doors that are open for you, right? So you can do brand partnerships on Instagram if you have an engaged community who trusts you and is influenced by you. You can certainly do therapy groups, you can do coaching, you can sell courses or memberships, or you can start a podcast. And for me, I wanted to start a podcast for years before I decided to actually take that plunge. So when I actually started my second Instagram page, Business of Therapy, in December of 2022, I did so with the plan for it to be a page for my podcast, right? My bio actually said podcast coming soon. And it wasn't until almost 2 years later in August 2024 that I decided to start the podcast. And for me, I really realized that if I was going to do a podcast, I wanted to do it well, and it was going to be a huge time commitment. And so I had other priorities that I wanted to take care of before I started my podcast. Number one, I think that it's really important to make sure that you have a full caseload and that your private practice is doing well, it is stable before you decide to take on something like a podcast. I don't think that a podcast is the most effective marketing tool for therapists trying to fill their caseload. So I would definitely make sure that that is checked off of your list before you decide to start. For me, I wanted to make sure that my Instagram was really established. So by that point, I had already grown my Sit with Kelly Instagram page to, I don't know, maybe 50,000 followers or something. I don't have the numbers in front of me here. But I was just starting my second Instagram page, Business of Therapy. And as anybody knows who has started an Instagram page, it is a ton of work to build up a new page from scratch, right? And I really wanted to make sure that I was dedicating time to that because I think it's a lot easier to reach new audiences on Instagram than with a podcast. And Instagram, having an established Instagram presence can actually bring you a lot of listeners for your podcast. And so I wanted to make sure that my Business of Therapy Instagram page was growing and that I had the systems in place to be consistent on both pages without stress, right? Without feeling behind or like I didn't have enough hours in the day. And so that was really important to me. Something else I really wanted to make sure happened before I started the podcast was that I had team support that felt stable, right? There's a lot of different moving pieces in my business between my therapy practice, one-on-one coaching work, my group coaching, my course, my membership. And so I wanted to make sure that anything that didn't need to be done by me, any backend, any admin, any customer service, any tech type stuff, that I felt like I had a team who I could delegate to, that could handle it without me getting involved before I took on another huge project of a podcast. I wanted to make sure I had extra capacity, right, in my schedule to commit to recording new episodes and releasing them every single week, to planning, to promoting the podcast. And that took a lot of time, right? Because I've always been somebody who's pretty rigid with my work and that I don't want it to bleed over into my personal life. My work-life balance is really, really important to me. And so I wanted to make sure that I had that extra capacity in my schedule before taking on a big project like the podcast. And then lastly, I knew that I had no desire whatsoever to learn the like tech and back end side of things of, editing a podcast, uploading it to the hosting platforms, all of that. And so I wanted to make sure that my business could support me investing in a podcast editor. So that's sort of like, I think, how to think about readiness for a podcast. I think it's also really important to think about your why. So for me, I started a podcast because I wanted somewhere to go deeper than I was on Instagram. Now, I try my absolute best to share the reel on Instagram, to not have it just be like a highlight reel. But the reality is that when I have a really hard or stressful day, or a day where things are not going right in my business, I'm usually too busy to hop on stories and to talk about them, right? And so, I do think that a lot of what ends up on my Instagram page and on other people's Instagram page is sort of a highlight reel because, when you think about it just from your own personal account, what do you want to share? Right? It's like the fun vacation. It's like the cool dinner. It's the picture of your happy, smiling baby. And you're rarely pulling out your phones in those hard moments where the baby is crying or you're eating microwave leftovers or, you're head down in your office working all day. And so for me, I think that it was really important, especially as somebody who coaches other therapists, that I wanted to have a space where I was committed to regularly sharing the hard about business as well, right? To sharing the lessons learned, the messy in betweens, the middle. So that way therapists could go into this with eyes wide open and know, yes, there is so much beauty in having a six-figure practice and having a business that gives you freedom and flexibility and financial resources. But that's not without hard. And if things feel hard, it's not because you're doing it wrong. That's just sort of like what it takes sometimes to build a successful business. So that's really my sort of why behind building this podcast. And I want you to sort of like ask yourself the same question, right? What is your why? What are you hoping to get out of it? If your answer is that you are hoping to fill your caseload, I would encourage you to pick another marketing platform like Instagram instead. I really do think that your caseload should be full before you even consider starting a podcast. I would also think about like mastering Instagram already. That doesn't mean that you need to have, tens and thousands of followers, but you should have an engaged audience. You should feel like you understand how Instagram works. Your engagement is steadily improving. Your followers are steadily improving. People are in your DMs. They want to hear what you have to say because that's going to be how you get listeners, especially in the beginning when you have a new podcast show. You need people who you're going to tell about the podcast and who are going to want to listen. And so I think that having mastered Instagram to some degree is really, really helpful. I would also ask yourself if you have extra time to plan a podcast launch in the near future. It's really important to promote your podcast. Again, that's how you're going to get listeners. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what goes into that in today's episode. I would also make sure you have an extra 3 to 5 hours a week ongoing for the podcast. It's not, just sit down, record a 20-minute episode, log off. You have to, plan the episode, record the episode, promote the episode. If you're not hiring a podcast manager, there's a lot of back-end tech stuff to do, all of that. And then, the last thing I would really think about is what do you hope a podcast will do for you and for your business? And again, if the goal is filling your caseload, I really do not think podcasting is a good strategy on its own because people find podcasts through creators they already like, know, and trust or through word of mouth, right? They don't really just find them like randomly in the podcast app. And so Instagram is a place where your content is constantly getting discovered by new people and potential clients every day. So I think that that is just a lot more helpful. If you are somebody who's like, yeah, but Kelly, I love podcasting. Like I want to use that as a tool to fill my caseload. I would actually encourage you to try and be a guest on other people's podcasts and to pitch yourself that way, where you can sort of like borrow someone else's audience. That can be a lot more of an effective strategy of getting in front of a lot of new people with every episode that you're doing versus having to build your own podcast from scratch and not really having that built-in audience. So something to think about there. Let's talk about the sponsorship and the sort of finances that can come with a podcast. Podcasts can be a really helpful way to open the door to new income and new brand deals. So I've, like I shared in the beginning of this episode, brought in $82,000 since starting this podcast 17 months ago, which is really, really cool. And I actually did that by reaching out to podcast sponsors. So I reached out to brands that were aligned, and they were all brands actually that I previously worked with and had established relationships with. And some of these brands said no, but some of them said yes, which is amazing. So I secured partnerships pretty seamlessly, to be honest. Which was really nice. So my first podcast sponsor was Jane, and they have been with me since the beginning, since the very first episode of this podcast, which I'm so grateful for. And they took a chance, right? I offered them a reduced rate in the beginning, and the first 5 months we did that like at a reduced rate. And then we went up and they said, okay, Kelly, like, yes, we see your listeners here. We're seeing engagement. We're seeing people sign up for the Jane platform through your podcast. And so now they are on my full rate after that, sort of initial trial period. My other podcast sponsor is Alma, and they've been with me since month 3, which is so exciting as well. And then the third sponsor, which I don't like count any revenue for, is my own business, right? So you'll hear ads from sort of those 3 groups on the podcast, from Jane, from Alma, and from myself. And I really think that there's a lot of value in using a podcast to promote your own business and your own offerings. So I started my podcast in August of 2024. And in November of 2024, I got the first email from somebody saying that the reason why they decided to join the Private Practice Academy bundle was because of the podcast. And Rachel Sleeper, if you are listening, you are that first person for me. So that will always be something that I remember and cherish, which is just so, so, so exciting. She said the podcast is a huge selling point too. It is my Wednesday midweek pick me up. And so I think that that's just really cool to sort of see, you can use a podcast to promote other people's businesses and services, but you can also really use it to build a lot of trust and to promote your own offerings, which is really effective and really fun. And, the way that I've charged podcast sponsors is a fixed rate per month. And that's really unusual in the podcast space. And I think the reason I'm able to do that is because of how hyper niche down this podcast is, right? So if somebody wants to promote, resources for therapists building a private practice, there might be, I don't know, a dozen podcasts that they could advertise on, maybe 50 podcasts max. And then, we have to see like how many listeners are those podcast episodes getting? What's the quality of their episode? Are these like brands that the company wants to be associated with? And so there's not a ton of competition, right? And we know that the ads are going to be very effective because they're reaching a really, really, really specific audience. And so because of that, I've been able to sort of like build out sponsorships in a very different way than, let's say, I was building a podcast where I was just talking about like being a new mom, right? That's not like a very specific podcast. There's a lot of different, new moms. There's a lot of different stages of life and parenting that those parents might be in. And so brands aren't getting as much value for their advertisement when we're not being super, super niche specific. And so because I'm very niche specific, I've been able to charge, a fixed rate per month for podcast sponsors, which has been amazing. Versus the typical way to do podcast ads is charging, they call it cost per mile, which dictates a set fee for every 1,000 listener downloads. And according to Google, rates typically range from $15 to $40 per 1,000 listener downloads. And I think that that's really helpful just to sort of put into perspective. So if we did my 65,000 listeners, and we even did the high end of that range, right? $40 per 1,000 listeners. That would make this podcast so far have only earned $2,600 versus the $82,000 that I have made thus far with the podcast. And so that's a huge difference. And I think that that's something to really consider when you are launching a podcast is if one of your main goals is sponsorship, how can you build a podcast that is going to be niche specific enough that you can offer insane value for your sponsors in order to really ask for higher rates. Because if not, then what you really have to play is the volume game, right? And maybe you're somebody who has a big Instagram audience and that would be easy for you to do, in which case, amazing, go for it. But you really need like a lot of downloads in order to make money if you are, getting paid $40 per 1,000 downloads. To put things into context, if we were again getting paid on that higher end of $40 per 1,000 downloads, you would need to have had over 2 million downloads to earn $82,000 in that model, right? And so I think that that's helpful with like level setting of if one of your main drivers of having a goal for this is sponsorship, expect it to take quite a while until that becomes like a lucrative referral source or a lucrative revenue source, unless you are really going to be hyper niche specific and you have experience doing brand partnerships already and can showcase the results and conversions that you'll get for brands. Okay, so let's talk about actual steps for starting a podcast. Obviously, I think that this sort of flows into each other a little bit here, but you won't be surprised when I say this. The number one first step that is important to do is to niche down, right? I would recommend aligning your Instagram niche with your podcast niche if that is where you are planning to get the majority of your listeners. And so, niche down, figure out what is it that you are going to talk about. I think it's also helpful to think about the style of the show. So, are you going to mostly do solo episodes? Are you going to mostly do interviews? Are you mostly going to teach and educate about something? Or are you going to more do like storytelling and yapping? How do you want people to feel while listening? Do you want people like sitting down, taking notes? Do you want people to feel like, you're their bestie or they're laughing? What is your kind of vibe there? And then what is sustainable for you in terms of posting? I do think that posting weekly is probably the most helpful. Either just weekly year round, I think is probably preferred in terms of building an audience because you kind of continue that momentum. The other option that I see being viable for some people is sort of doing seasons, right? So maybe you'll do like a 12-week season and you'll post weekly for 12 weeks and then you'll take a break and you'll do like a second season later in the year or something. But the reason why I don't always recommend that is that you're kind of like building up momentum and getting listeners. And then at the end of the season, you sort of like fall out of people's routine, you fall out of their podcast queue. And so when you start a new season, it's kind of like this rebuild every single time. And I think you're probably better off from a growth standpoint, just continuing all the way through. Now, for me, when I was deciding like how I wanted to structure this show, I had to really think about my goals. So one, I wanted the opportunity to go deeper with my audience. And so that really like pushed me to do a lot more solo episodes because I wanted to share what was happening in my own business and my own insights. I also really wanted to establish myself as an expert, right? I wanted to use this podcast to market my courses, my membership, my coaching. And so it was important to me that I was being an authority on my podcast. And so for that reason, I rarely bring in other guests for my podcast. I do try and do one guest per month. And usually you'll see that those guests are an alumni of one of my programs versus, another business coach in this space. Because my goal is not to have this podcast just to like increase listeners and to promote other people's businesses, but instead I wanted to give myself a platform to share more about my own experiences, right? I wanted to position myself as an expert. I wanted to get more therapists coming into my world. Versus, if you are a therapist, maybe, and you're wanting to do a podcast like in the therapy space, maybe it is helpful for you to have guests on your podcast where you can sort of show those active listening skills, where you can reflect insights back to people, where you can sort of show people, how your brain thinks clinically. I think could be really valuable. Another pro to like having a more interview style podcast is that sometimes it can be easier to grow, especially if you secure big guests who share the episodes that they're on with their big audience. But again, that trade off is you're sort of in the backseat as the interviewer and you're really positioning the guest as the expert a lot of the times. So something to sort of consider there. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is actually launching a podcast. So I hired a podcast manager to help with the launch of the podcast. And since then, she's worked with me on a monthly basis to actually edit all of my episodes and get them uploaded. But here is sort of like the rundown of what goes into launching a podcast. One, you need to design cover art or hire someone to design cover art, but you need, cover art for your show. You need to script, record, edit an intro, an outro, and a trailer. You need to write your show description. I really recommend launching your podcast with 3 episodes that first day. And that's just going to give people something to binge. It's going to get their buy-in for the show. It's going to increase your listenership that first week. Maybe you'll actually like chart and rank, which I did, which is super exciting because you have 3 episodes for people to listen to in that 1 week. And then I also recommend having at least the next 2 weeks after your launch date recorded, which is what I did. So I had 5 episodes total recorded before I hit launch. You'll need to edit and mix the episodes or have somebody edit and mix them. And so for editing, I mean like taking out any filler words, taking out any pauses, taking out when you mess up. If you're somebody who has ads and sponsors for your own business or for other businesses, somebody needs to mix those in, mixing in your music with your intro and your outro, all of that. Having show notes that are going into the actual podcast player and also on your website. If you are going to have guests on the podcast, making sure that you have workflows and systems set up for you to book them, schedule them, record with them, all of that. And then a launch plan, right? A launch plan is super, super important because that's how you're going to get listeners. So making sure that you are dedicating time and space in your content calendar, that you are thinking intentionally about how you are going to actually launch your podcast and get people to listen. Now, you guys know I'm always about transparency, so I will be the first to name it. It was really, really hard to launch a podcast. It was much more work than I anticipated, right? I sort of had that list and I was like, okay, easy. Check, check, check. I'll be able to figure that out. But it took a lot of hours for me to start a podcast. And I was surprised how hard it was for me to record episodes in the beginning. I've done a lot of teaching. I've done a lot of coaching. I've recorded a ton of lessons for my course, the Private Practice Academy bundle. But it felt kind of weird to record episodes in the beginning and to sort of have this one-way conversation. And so in the beginning, I basically had, I don't know, maybe like a 6-page script per episode that I was almost reading directly off of because I just felt like I wanted to have such clear, succinct thoughts before I hit record. Now I'm able to do a lot better with just a few bullet points and sort of fill in the rest. But yeah, in the beginning, scripting episodes took me much longer than recording it. If I was going to do a 30-minute episode, it might take me 2 hours to write the script and then 30 minutes to record it. So that was super time intensive. And it was scary to do that before I actually launched the podcast because I had no idea if people were going to listen. But of course they did, which is super exciting. Thank you for listening and for being here. And as with anything, it has gotten easier over time, right? Now that we're at over 65,000 downloads, I can definitely say people are listening. 81 episodes in, I can say I'm a much faster scripter, editor, or now 81 episodes in, I can say I'm much faster at outlining episodes, at recording them. And so, with anything, I tell therapists this all the time when they're starting on Instagram, but it's really important to let yourself be a beginner, to not overcomplicate it, and to just sort of figure out how can you do it to, support yourself with the extra reassurance if you need of having a full script that you'll read. I certainly needed that in the beginning, but do it if you feel excited and so inclined. Because at the end of the day, I think that there's a lot of challenges with podcasts, right? It's not passive by any means. It's more long form content. That consistency takes a lot of discipline. And there's sort of like less instant gratification with listeners. Like, when you post an Instagram reel, you can see the likes and comments and follows, come in right away if it does well. But with podcasting, you don't really get to see that because people are listening in a platform that doesn't allow for that engagement. And so it's not until you look at your analytics and all that you can really see, that people are listening, that they're here. And once those DMs start to come in and people start to like reach out to you on other platforms and share takeaways from the episode, it's just so valuable and it feels so, so good. But I do think it's really worth it despite a lot of those hards once you are at a stage in your business where it makes sense, right? It builds a lot of trust with your audience. It nurtures your audience. It warms people up to work with you. And I've honestly had so much fun with it. It's been really cool. One of my favorite pieces has been getting to bring on alumni of my program and get to like really speak with them on a deeper level and hear more about their stories. And it's just like really motivated me in the work that I'm doing with coaching other therapists to get to have these longer conversations and like hear about all the life-changing things that have happened as a result of learning to market themselves on Instagram and starting their private practice. Okay, so to wrap up, podcasting definitely works best as a supporting way to nurture your current audience rather than a growth or a reach method, right? I think that podcasting works best when your overall marketing system is solid, when your caseload is full, and when you are wanting to find a way to go deeper with your audience, whether that is to sell another offer, to get brand sponsors, just to like, maybe it's a passion thing and it's something that you just want to do. That's totally okay too. And as a reminder, as a business owner, you get to choose the way to scale that supports your energy, your interests, your seasons, and your goals. And so if a podcast feels aligned to you, I would encourage you to find a way to make, space in your calendar for it. Find a way to figure out like the systems for it. Find a way to dedicate the time and the energy that it needs to be successful. And yeah, if you are interested in starting a podcast, I would love to hear about it. Please feel free to send me a DM on Instagram. Or if you're a therapist inside a private practice academy, you can always post in the VIP community and we can talk through it more there. I'm happy to give you feedback and support and advice and direction as you are figuring out your podcast topic or deciding whether or not this is something that you're ready for or if it's for you. And yeah, thank you, my friends. Have a wonderful rest of your day and I'll talk to you soon.